Viridity looked at James confused, the pupils in her striking blue eyes slightly flickering as she likely waited for a translation of what he had just said and an explanation for what had just happened. James looked over at Admir, and the two men nodded at each other for a moment. Then he raised his hand, indicating to wait just a little moment longer. Since James had just demonstrated that he had apparently come back to his senses, Admir happily stood back and let him pull off whatever last little trick he had in mind. James demonstratively cleared his throat before replying to Viridity in the language he would understand. "Just a minor understanding, please forgive us," he said, and starting to dust himself off and straighten out his improvised clothing. "But at least I'm already feeling much better now, so we can probably continue any moment now. And since it is such a nice day, we may as well do it right out here." Admir supported that proposal with an approving nod from his side. "It really is a nice day," he concurred, with a look up at the burning star above them. "I think this place will do nicely for further deliberations." James now also nodded approvingly, and shifted his gaze over to Tua, who was clearly listening to them from over where she was standing. "You don't have any objections, matriarch, do you?" he inquired politely, without actually leaving her much of a choice, since both ambassadors had already made their stance clear that that is how they wanted to proceed. Tua seemed a bit surprised to be addressed directly. However, she reacted quickly, raising her trunk and happily waving it around in a denying manner. "Of course not," she said, and started to walk over to the two men, as it seemed her presence would be needed again, now that things were going to proceed. However, James quickly raised his hand, stopping her in her tracks with a now even more, almost morbidly curious look on her face. It didn't go past James that the expression on Jewel Friend's face changed as well, after witnessing his slightly imperious gesture towards the High Matriarch. "Actually, I have one more request, if that is alright with you," James quickly and politely clarified. Right at that moment, as if on cue, the door to the garden opened, and the servant, that was just earlier sent to fetch some water for James, arrived, carrying the, to her, absolutely minuscule glass of water between the tips of one end of her trunk. "Perfect timing," James happily exclaimed, and thankfully accepted the glass from the massive woman. Carefully he took a swig, wetting his hoarse throat, and enjoying the coolness of the liquid in the hot starlight. The people around curiously studied him as he did so. The servant was just about to leave and go back to her work, however Tua stopped her with a movement of her trunk, awaiting whatever request James would have. James quickly put the glass down again and looked back up at the monstrous face of the matriarch, whose 6 eyes focused on him in a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. James's next move was a gamble, to be sure, but honestly, what did he have to lose now? From this point, it was pretty much all or nothing anyway, so he might as well bet high. "I think, before we continue, now would be a good time to give the ambassador a little something to clear the air after our little misunderstanding, don't you think?" he said, checking her reaction. She didn't seem entirely sure where he was going with this, however there was a very clear suspicion hiding behind her gaze. James couldn't keep the smirk from his face. Knew it, he thought to himself, delighted that his suspicion seemed to be spot on. It was about time that something was going his way for once. Of course, that was assuming he had interpreted the matriarch's reaction correctly. Still, while he was usually not a gambling man, he decided to, this time, bet it all on black. "Do you remember the sword I had with me when I first arrived here?" he asked, keeping his polite and cheerful smile on his face, and it seemed that Tua did indeed know what he was talking about. So the gamble was paying off. "Would you have it fetched for me, please? I think of all times this would be an especially good one to hand it back over to the human territory's hands and bring it back to where it belongs, don't you think?" The matriarch stared at him intensely. Clearly, she was thinking how he knew that she had the weapon here. It had mostly been a guess, if he was honest. But then again, where else would it have been? Admittedly, there were probably plenty of options, but he had just had a feeling that they would have kept the item at his side, but out of his reach. However, Tua now got a taste of her own medicine, as she wasn't afforded the time to think through her decision, given the current situation. She could only deny it, making James appear in a bad light, or comply, which would seemingly have no direct negative consequences for her, but would show that James had a measure of control that she was clearly uncomfortable with. How does it feel? James thought spitefully, smirking at the Colossus internally, but still keeping up his polite facade outwardly. The contemplation didn't last for long. "Of course! I'll have it brought for you right away," Tua replied, closing all 6 of her eyes and raising her voice to an uncomfortable pitch, before waving the servant over, clearly to explain where exactly the girl could find the item in question. Meanwhile, Amir leaned in closer to James, watching the Colossi exchange words alongside his old teammate. "A sword?" Amir asked, both confused and curious. James scoffed ever so slightly. "I've paid 50,000 for that thing. I'm not leaving it here," he replied with a sly smile. causing a genuine burst of laughter from his ex. "Well, okay, but make it quick," Admir grunted with a laugh. James noticed that Hafety and Cecile were all but amused at the two men joking with each other in the home language, Hafety more so than Cecile. So while the servant was hurrying back into the estate with the task of finding and fetching the Martian Mameluke, James stepped over to his two previous instructors. "Such a nice day, isn't it?" he mused aloud, stepping up to the two much larger beings. "Quite," Hafety replied, uncharacteristically taciturnally for her usually quite bubbly nature. "Well, I can't imagine worse settings for diplomacy," Cecile admitted, looking up at the sky and shielding his eyes from the harsh light with the spread feathers of his wings. Then he turned his head a slight bit more, so he could look down at James comfortably with a sideways-facing eye. "If I may ask, what was the misunderstanding you and Ambassador Doe had earlier?" The "if I may ask" part was feigned, of course. In Cecile's mind, James was in no position to not volunteer that information. "Oh, that," James said, chuckling and scratched with his beard with his nails. "Well, nothing major. He had some, let's say, preconceived notions before he came here, which were only strengthened by our negotiations earlier. And I have to admit, an unfortunate comment from my side may have been perceived as a confirmation of that by him. A mistake that I quickly tried to correct, of course. However, it was enough so that things got a bit heated for a moment." To his surprise, Cecile seemed to be satisfied with that explanation, and didn't feel the need to pry any further. However, that explanation had instead gained Hafety's attention once again, and she chimed into the conversation. "But you have cleared things up again, haven't you?" she asked intently, and her pupils narrowed to small, burning dots. "Transparently so," James replied, and tried his best to put on a challenging look without dropping his polite exterior. He also added, "It was just a minor mistake, nothing to worry about." "Threaten me. I dare you," he thought to himself. Of course she wouldn't. Not while Admir was there as well. But still, something inside him almost wanted her to. Wanted to feel that satisfaction of hearing her try to play her trump card, and not having to give a shit about it. But he would have to wait for that a bit longer. "Good," was all Hafety said, slowly with a deep strumming of her voice. "Yeah," James replied spitefully. Although they didn't have to wait too long for the servant to arrive back in the garden, carrying the blade within its beautifully crafted sheath, her sheer size making it look like a toothpick in comparison. Granted, an extremely sharp and quite deadly toothpick, but the comparison still stood. James waited patiently for the servant to make her way over to him, accepting the sword gratefully, while also waving the Leader Supreme over to himself. As soon as he felt the sword in his hand, despite its size and despite it still being sheathed, he felt his confidence skyrocket. To think that the mere presence of the weapon alone had that much of an effect on him was slightly disconcerting, but right now it was also what he needed. And luckily, it was a sword made for one hand. One way or the other, he had already stayed here way too long. Now, it was time to tip the scales a bit. As soon as Tua was within a reasonable earshot, James made a show of turning towards Admir and presenting the sword to him. "A Martian Captain's Mameluke," he announced, while Admir reached for the weapon carefully. "I found it back on the GCS as a pawnbroker. While I wonder how it found its way there, I thought it should probably be given back into the human military's hands. Take it as a sign of goodwill." "A nice sword, but that's more your or Andres' métier," Admir commented, putting the weapon from his sheath and inspecting the sharp blade of dark metal. He gave it a hesitant swing, weighing it in his hand and testing his balance, before quickly putting it back into its protective hull and hastily thrusting the re-secured blade back into James's hand. "Is that all now? Because I'm really getting sick of this place." James scoffed as he secured the blade to his body, with the sling attached to his sheath. "You should try staying for a month or two. Maybe that would give him some perspective." "Yes, I believe that was all," James replied, but didn't bother switching back to English like Admir had done before him. No reason to play hide-and-seek anymore. "What was that?" Tua immediately piped up and looked at James with serious eyes. "What do you mean, that was all?" James looked at Admir, and he responded with a thumbs up. "That was all I had to do here. My part is done, and quite frankly, I'm tired. I'm tired and I'd like to go home now. There's no reason for me to remain at this place," he summarized, turning towards Tua and putting his hand on the sword's hilt for comfort. "The ambassador has sent a message back to the ship, and the Emerald commanding it has agreed to take me back to Earth. In short, I am leaving." James couldn't deny the rush that statement brought with it. It was like electricity flowed through his body in a wild current, making him tingle all over. He could feel the shock around him. Mouth stood agape, eyes widened and pupils narrowed. Ears started to flutter, and trunks and wings were threateningly raised. Only Admir crossed his arms in satisfaction, and James could see the grin on his face before his inner eye. "You are leaving?" Tua repeated back at him questioningly. Out of all the people present, she had her demeanour under control the best, and she seemingly wasn't quite ready to drop all pretenses and pretending yet. "And did you think about that hard and well?" "I've had more than enough time to think," James replied sinisterly. "You could say I've had nothing but time recently." Then he lifted his voice ever so slightly, changing his tone to a less dark, a more challenging one, and adding, "Besides, it's not like I'm a prisoner here, is it?" He dared her to challenge that statement. "You aren't," Tua replied, and the way she emphasized the word you made it clear that she implied that someone else was. An empty threat, as James now knew for sure, one that held no power over him anymore, like a huge weight had been lifted off him. It was like he had suspected. He didn't have to give a shit anymore, and admittedly, it felt great. "Then there should be nothing keeping me here," he said. "I thank you for the food and the accommodation, but now our time together has come to an end. Farewell, High Matriarch." Tua's eyes narrowed, as James and Admir started to walk away from them. James noticed Highfoot and Seal take steps in their direction, and he closed his hand tighter around the weapon's hilt. He may have been rusty and weakened by his stay here, but those two he could still handle. Apparently they knew that too, and they stood back, not keen on sharing the fate that their colleague had suffered when he had tried to stand in James's way before. James wondered where Reprig was now, but he couldn't waste energy on pondering that. Who was of more immediate concern were the guards that still had the task of protecting this place, and that could be called to the matriarch's assistance at any moment. Of course, James and Admir had backup too, but it would be better for everyone involved if they didn't have to use it. "Any idea how we're getting out of here?" Admir asked from James's side, and his movement of his masked face told of him scanning the garden's high walls. "We climb," James simply replied briefly. "You can't be serious," Admir replied, before stopping for a moment and staring off into space, apparently listening to something that James couldn't hear. That might be an idea. While he was wondering about just what idea just had been proposed to Admir, and by whom exactly, James suddenly got another grim reminder of just how much his time around here had changed him for the worse. Something buried into the ground next to him, exploding moss and dirt everywhere, forcing James to shield his eyes from the debris, and leaving behind nothing but a steaming hole. Shortly after, the loud, ear-piercing snap of something breaking the sound barrier many times over rang out. James's first instinct was to turn towards the source of the noise, and he couldn't suppress it in time, so he turned his back away from whatever had presumably been shot at. Instead, he uselessly stared at the hill in the distance, from where the bullet had originated. However, despite James's inept reaction, the shot itself had not missed its purpose. Just a few steps away from James, Yrrol friend stood frozen in place, staring down at the spot where a projectile had just dug into the floor at something like 20 times the speed of sound, which was about as fast as it got when it came to conventional weaponry, at least with projectiles of this size. James turned and stared up at the Colossus, confused as to when the ball had managed to make it this close to him. Apparently Abby's brief conversation with him had been enough to distract him from the fact that he was being sneaked up on. Had he really gotten so inattentive? That blunder meant that the cat was out of the bag now, and while James wasn't happy about that, he had no choice but to use it now, especially since the sniper, once revealed, was on borrowed time. James turned towards the people that surrounded the two humans, looking up at their faces and loudly announcing, "I would recommend not trying to stop us. That just now was a warning shot, but I can guarantee you, any further one will be deathly accurate." "You little..." Yrrol friend started to grumble. However, Admir interrupted him. "Would you like a demonstration?" he exclaimed, and bent down for a second. Then he yelled, "Think fast," while tossing something over at James. James had to let go of the sword, as he shot around and just barely managed to catch the large, spherical thing in between his arm and his body. What the hell was he thinking? Again? He looked down at the thing. It was the fruit of one of the gigantic trees around them that had apparently fallen off at some point. A demonstration? James was slowly starting to get what Admir was after. It seemed that, now that he didn't have to worry anymore, he returned more to his old self. And apparently he desperately wanted to show off, or more precisely, he wanted to get James to show off, which was something that Admir had loved to do back in the day. Usually, James didn't like this approach to things. However, right now, he was still in an exceptionally ecstatic mood that made him ever so slightly cocky, so he was more welcoming to the idea than he usually would have been. To give you an idea, he loudly announced, turning to the people that surrounded them once again. He demonstratively raised the fruit, putting it on his head, and stretched out his arm. Sam heard Buzz's announcement and watched him place the fruit on his head. Her crosshairs were quickly on it, and she released a long breath from her lungs. At this distance, she didn't even need the help of her computer. As long as everyone remained within her field of vision, that was. With a quick twitch of her finger, another shot was released. Even she couldn't help but grin, as the fruit immediately exploded, showering Buzz in pulp and juice all over. He had needed a shower anyway. The aftershock and wind following the round, while he threw his hair around, as the bullet dug deeper into the ground, kicking up moss and dirt up and throwing it everywhere. Sam could hear Buzz and Admir laughing through the camera feed, and Buzz started to brush the leftovers of his demonstration out of his hair with his hand. As you can see, our guardian angel is quite unerring, James explained. She's almost as good a shot as me. That damn bastard! No way was he still a better shot than her after not practicing for such a long time. But she could let him have it later. She'd much rather prove she was better than just claim it anyway. For now, she had to focus on the people on the ground. If one of them made a wrong move, she was there to make them regret it in the split second before they died. She could put a bullet into their head before any of these snails could even think about doing anything about it. However, the clock was ticking. The demonstration had been fun and all, and had hopefully given the boys the necessary room to breathe, but it was really high time that they got out of there now, before the news of those shots would reach the wrong kind of people. We're not here to start a war. Sam could now hear Abba explain to the people on the ground. He stepped forward and gesticulated with both arms, looking like a businessman making a sales pitch in his form-fitted suit. We're merely here to get our ambassador back. Stay put, and nothing will happen to any of you. The tree person and the parrot seemed to be too lost in thought to reply. The monster elephant guards were staying back for the moment, apparently waiting for order, while the big one on steroids still glared daggers at Buzz. That just left the VIP. Can I take this as a sign that this whole event has been premeditated on your end, James? The leader supreme asked James, with a dark look in his direction. You know what this might mean for you, don't you? Don't let it go, you Buzz, Sam thought to herself, watching as James looked up at the Titan spitefully. Just get out of there while you still can. Sadly, Buzz could not read her mind, and apparently he had either forgotten to, or just couldn't manage to keep his balance in check. But as he had no comms in his ears, she would have to scold him for it later. I don't think it means anything for me, Buzz replied to the Colossus. The muscular one right next to him shifted in place, and Sam quickly brought her crosshair around onto his head, James seemingly noticing him shifting as well, and slowly, with a visage of poor spite in his face, he started walking towards him, staring up at his face the whole time, daring him to try to do anything, daring the man to strike him. Sam didn't like that at all. This wasn't like him. Still, she would do her job if the bull would actually try anything stupid, provoked or not. Luckily, he seemed to have his temper under control, if only just. I've taken the liberty to inform James about the lies you've apparently been feeding him, Admiral informed the Leader Supreme, while simultaneously walking up to James to try and gently lead him away. How do you know they are lies? The Zodiatus challenged him, with a self-assured chuckle. However, Admir, fully in balance, couldn't give less of a damn about her impertinence. We have our ways, he said, while he only slowly managed to get Buzz to tear his gaze loose from the Colossus to walk away. The Leader Supreme made a strange movement of her head. Sam had no idea how to interpret it, but it seemed almost recognizing. So, they're with the humans now, the VIP mused aloud. Smarter than she looked, that one. There was an official warrant out for their arrest, the muscular one suddenly yelled out, and friendly waved his trunk around as if shaking a fist. We both sighted ourselves. Everyone in the community was looking for them. You're telling me the humans had them this whole time, and they didn't extradite them? That is treason. It isn't treason to act on a warrant set out by a traitor, Admir replied, in the most official voice Sam had ever heard coming out of his mouth. At least that is our stand on things. In the end, it will be up to the community to decide all of our fates. But we will only accept it after everything is out in the open, and the integrity of the Council is restored in full. Until then, humanity has decided to act in the interest of the people and absolve itself of the orders of the Council. The off-worlder stared at the man making this grand declaration in disbelief, seemingly shock-stunned at the sheer audacity of such an announcement made by a single man. Sam's expression must have been not too different from theirs. This entire mission was starting to turn into a shit show. Stop talking, A direct order suddenly came over the comm lines. Apparently Andrzej had had enough. "Get out of there already!" "Yeah, we're leaving," Admin replied, putting a hand around Buzz's shoulder and starting to lead him away. "I don't know how much longer I can give you support, so make it quick," Sam announced over the communications. There wasn't a sign of someone coming for her yet, but that could change any second. "You're funny," Admin replied. And as he and Buzz walked closer to the walls, they disappeared from Sam's sights, and she had to switch over to camera and computer-guided aiming for the moment, seeing the lines of where she was aiming appear on the screen attached to her gun, projected right into the feed she got from Admin's camera. "We still got that big-ass wall to climb." "No time!" Andrzej's voice suddenly came over the comms once again. "We can't give them time to mobilize, and our stealth has already been compromised. We're taking the fast and easy way out. Sam, do you read me?" "Copy, sir," Sam replied, hoping that he was going to say what she thought he was going to say. "You have permission for a single shot of the RR," the Major informed her. "One shot. In atmosphere setting 5. Continued release. Corners 531-208-881. Bring down that wall, and make it snappy, will ya?" "Yes, sir," Sam excitedly stated. The order meant that she would leave the boys uncovered for a moment, but the enemy didn't know that. Immediately, she swiped the Highsmith sniper rifle off of the branch he was prone on, causing it to fall for a moment before snapping around on the belt it was secured with and hanging in the air for a while. Then she reached for another belt that was fastened around her hip area and pulled the heavy RR at the end of it, that had already been heating up for the entirety of the mission, up onto the branch, posing it in front of her. The RR, or Relativity Rifle, was the highest of high ends in human weapon technology. The lethality of the very forces of nature that held the universe together, all packed in a nice handheld form. This weapon used an old, outdated and unstable FTL technology that was once upon a time researched on for possible use in spacecraft, back before humanity had discovered how to stabilize hyperspace stretches. The hyperspace created by it had been way too unstable for any use in space travel. However, some years later, they had discovered that it was just right for weaponry. Almost inevitable, and nearly unstoppable, a shot out of this baby, fired by a sufficiently skilled marksman, meant near certain doom for who, or whatever, was unlucky enough to find itself at the wrong end of its barrel, and all that at an incredible level of accuracy. When it came to warfare, and depending on who you asked, maybe even overall, it was one of humanity's greatest achievements. And Sam was one of only a few thousand people who had sufficient permissions to shoot one of them out in the field. "In atmosphere setting 5, continue release, corners 531-208-881, copy that." She repeated the specifics of the permitted shot back in the Major, while she aimed at the spot on the wall far away from any people. It was really lucky that the garden was so comically large. This way she didn't even have to tell anybody to stand back. "Permission to fire," Andrzej replied. "Relatively round out," Sam announced over the communication. With an honest-to-God smile on her face, she pressed down the trigger. Different to what one might have expected, there was no recoil, not backblast. The massive weapon fired smooth as a whistle. All Sam noticed of the shot on her end was the blinding flare of light that was blocked out by the tinted glass of her breath filter, as the air ignited in front of her, sending out a flash of white that engulfed everything for a huge radius for a brief moment. There had been no round in the chamber. There didn't need to be. Actually, there mustn't be. In atmosphere, firing a projectile at the speeds generated by the weapon could have been cataclysmic. In the in-atmosphere setting, the generated hyperspace itself functioned as the projectile, along with whatever molecules of gas it started to accelerate along its way. The one near absolute downside of an RR was that it gave away your position entirely. Everyone within a multiple kilometer radius learned that now, as a streak of blinding, burning light appeared instantly between the end of Sam's barrel and her target, connecting sniper to target with a well-visible line, like this was some sort of video game. A deafening bang rang out, echoing over the land many times before it slowly faded out. And once the flash of light had also faded enough that Sam could see again, a large portion of the wall was gone, vaporized, crumbled to dust, and broken respectively. The further away from the center of the shot one looked. And yet, the moss on the ground behind it was not even singed. The shot had stopped exactly at the wall, hitting nothing but its target. A terrifying weapon indeed. Even Sam had to admit that. However, she didn't have time to admire the aftermath of steaming air and slight distortions of light for long, because now she could hear something closing in on her position. Still far from now, but approaching quickly. She wouldn't be able to stay much longer. "I'm getting company. I'll try to cover you as long as I can, but I'm going to have to dip soon," Sam informed over the radio. Sorry, boys, time's not on your side. Andrzej looked over at the place where the wall had just crumbled at an instant, leaning over the handlebar of his ATC and bopping his foot nervously. Just make sure you're out of there before they come. Don't take unnecessary risks, Captain, he ordered, not wanting Sam to stick around for too long in the end. Copy that, sir, Sam replied, and Andrzej really hoped that she wouldn't push her luck. His attention then swung over to the other woman on his team. You ready for this, Tuya? He asked the figure, clad in dark, armored clothing, sitting on the ATC next to his own. Tuya sat up straighter and put both hands firmly onto the handlebar. Just try to keep up with me, Major, she replied, putting on a slightly mocking tone as she addressed him by his rank. They were interrupted by Admir's voice that came over the comms. Diamond, Graphite, this is Cole. I've secured Carbonado. Awaiting pickup at coordinates 531-208-881, he informed them, uselessly using their codenames all of a sudden, most likely because he found it funny. Won't dalliate, cover us just a second longer, alright? You got it, Cole, Sam replied, just playing along with it, because that was easier than discussing anything with Admir. We're on our way, just be ready for pickup when we arrive, Andrzej announced, nodding over at Tuya, who nodded right back at him. Immediately, she gave the spurs to her cycle, letting the wheels rev in anticipation. Andrzej now did the same. With yet another appreciative nod at each other, the two tore out of the alleyway they had been waiting in towards the hole in the wall of the estates. Their hiding spot had been a good distance away from the estate, since its immediate area was mostly surrounded by open fields, and so it would take them some time to arrive at their destination. Most cars had stopped on the streets, and people had gotten out of their vehicles after being blinded by the sudden flash of light, confused by the spatial explosion of the air. Still, the two humans weaved around the standing cars without slowing down, viewing the Sodaitos that stood around Gorkin as momentary obstacles. They sped through the streets, overtaking whatever vehicles were still slowly driving around, and sometimes they even ducked and dove right under some of the huge vehicles that blocked the way, in ways that weren't easy to avoid. On this small world full of giants, these ATCs gave them even more maneuverability than they would in the area they were originally constructed for. Small and agile like house cats, there was always a nook or a cranny they could slip through, always a gap they could exploit. No obstacle was absolute to these miniature invaders. Soon they had left the main jam of traffic behind them and were inbound towards their destination. And in the distance, Andrzej could already see two small silhouettes climb out of the rubble of the wall, stepping out into the open. Just moments earlier, James and Admir had made it most of the way through the garden and rapidly closed in on the rubble of the wall. Admir had just gotten off the communications with his team. Since James didn't have a breath filter with him like Admir did, he had to shield his face from the vapour and dust left on the wall. He was still slightly in shock that they had brought a fucking relativity rifle on a mission like this. He didn't even know if those things were legal in the community yet. Still, he couldn't entirely deny being the slightest bit glad to have this kind of firepower around. It was certainly enough to keep any of their would-be pursuers from picking up their trail, at least for the time being. A weapon like this wasn't quite getting nuked from orbit, but it was a close second, and even more terrifying in some ways. As he trudged through the smoke, a form suddenly appeared to his right. It was small, slender, and asymmetrical, with one side being taken up by something large they held in their hand, and their leg missing on the same side. I was wondering when you'd show up, James mentioned, looking at the form and causing Admir to stop in place, shooting around. Apparently he hadn't noticed the rodent right away. It wasn't surprising. James had a lot of practice by now. A fine mess you've made here, Malik replied, stepping out of the smoke and loosely holding his crutch under his arm. Aren't you going to get in our way? James asked facetiously, and smiled a toothy smile at the Deathworlder. Not making that mistake again, Malik said laughingly, and waved his crutch around. I just wanted to use the opportunity to see you off while no one is watching. James nodded. So, you're going to stick around? He asked. Even if I'm not here for you to observe anymore? Malik sniggered and shook his head. I still have things to do here and can't be postponed, he explained. And besides, to be completely honest, I've seen what I needed from you. James released a breath through his nose and stood up straight, looking at Malik dead on. Sky is a good kid, he said, with a firm and serious tone. Try to keep that around, you damn vermin. I will, Malik replied, leaning onto his crutch with both hands. Now go and get yourself killed somewhere else. I don't want to be bothered with the cleanup. Fuck you, Malik, James responded with a laugh. Get lost, freak, Malik replied, before stepping back into the smoke and disappearing out of sight. James looked after him for a moment, while Admir stared into the smoke confusedly. Then he turned his masked face towards James. What the fuck was that? He asked, tilting his head questioningly. It's a long story, James replied, and gestured for him to keep going. They had no time to lose, after all. Admin didn't seem quite satisfied with that reply, but apparently he resigned to have the story told to him over a drink some other time. As James stepped out over the rubble of the wall, the silhouettes of two masked riders, dressed in all black, already closed in on them. Admin nudged James's side with his elbow. You think you still got it? He asked mockingly, and started to walk away from the wall, out into the open area. Guess we'll find out, James said, looking at the rapidly closing figures and hearing the roaring of the wheels. If his timing wasn't good, this was going to hurt. Yet as he was by now on high alert, something behind him caught his attention, and he stepped away from the smoke slowly. Is Athena still on the line? He asked, turning his head towards Admir for a second. Admir looked around confusedly. Yes, she is. Why? He started. However, James didn't waste any time and immediately cut in again, saying, Tell her to take aim. I'm afraid this won't end pretty. Behind the two humans, within the large hole in the wall, the smoke began to shift around something big. Not just big. Colossal. Are you really that eager to die all of a sudden? James asked into the smoke, pulling the blade out of his sheath once again, and turning to face the approaching Titan with his weapon drawn. Because while I don't like killing, I can't deny that I would do you that favour. Dual friend. Slowly, the muscular Titan stepped out of the smoke, his dark form appearing bit by bit, as more and more smoke was pushed aside by his massive body. The Titan towered over James, glaring down at him with murder in his eyes. I don't care for death or pain. All I care for is my duty. Even though we've only known each other for a short time, you should know that much at this point. The large bull replied, his trunk pulling wafts of smoke after it, as it friendly swung around. His massive tusks threw dark shadows over James. All I know is that there won't be a whole lot of people that will be very broken up about you biting it, James responded, twirling the very well-balanced and razor-sharp blade in his hand. I have no respect or pity for a man whose own daughter has to be afraid of him. Still, I'll give you one more chance than you deserve. Walk away. Now. James glanced to the side. The approaching cycles, their pickup, was still a good distance away. Too far to arrive before an attack could happen. It is my duty to defend the High Matriarch and the matriarchal bloodline under any and all circumstances. You are threatening them. I had patience earlier for her sake. I do not now. I will stop you, the old friend explained, in a rough tone. You will fail, James replied. I am Dorofren, the bull exclaimed. It is a name, a title, a destiny. And where I fall, another will rise. There will always be Dorofren, and we do not fail. James could only scoff at the man. Now let us hope the next one has more of a brain than you, he said, and put one foot back, stance wide, body forward, weapon towards the enemy, his ride rushing towards him from the side. He looked up at the man. Come on then. I'm a good sport. I'll give you one attack. As James looked up at Dorofren's furious face, with fire burning behind his 6 eyes and tusks as big as trees sticking out of them, he remembered a time where he would have been afraid of it. Not just afraid, terrified. But not anymore. These people, they were nothing to fear. But Dorofren, he was someone to hate. The bull didn't hesitate. Didn't hold up with any preparations or etiquette. He just swung, unarmed and naked as the day he was born. The picture-perfect fool with muscle. The fighting here was done by fools. The trunk's wiry flesh offered near no resistance to the dark steel as it glided through it, severing brittle muscles and feeble tendons like cutting through soft butter. James ducked, letting the severed tip of the bull's trunk fly past him, carried on by the momentum of the attack, while the remaining stump on Dorofren's face missed his mark, merely spraying him with thick, dark blood as it swung past his face. The Colossus roared in anger and pain, loud enough to shake the ground and deafen James's ears. With all his massive strength, the Titan began to charge towards James, wanting to finish him off by simply ramming or trampling the small creature. But it was too late. James had given him one attack. Athena had honoured that. She would not allow another. Faster than the eye could see, something passed through Dorofren's head, tearing it apart. A spray of blood and viscera followed in its wake, as it descended into the ground, burying it into the floor. The snap of the shot only followed a moment later, as everything had already happened. It was all over faster than a nerve could fire, and therefore, a few signals remained in the Colossus's body, as he himself only slowly caught up with what had happened. The light of understanding briefly filled his eyes, before all light was extinguished from them forever. with the enormous muscles buckling one after another. First the Titan's shoulders, then his knees, and finally his entire body gave way, as the lifeless meat and bones that remained of the once imposing creature crumbled under his own enormous weight. James had to take a few quick steps back, so that he would not be hit by the massive tusks as they crashed against the floor, bursting and splintering on impact. Duelfriend was dead, the first known casualty of the conflict between the humans and the Unity.